After all, Alice Montague was married almost privately, and without any preparation. Tidings came that the Duke of Alençon was besieging Cosny, a city belonging to the Duke of Burgundy, and that instant relief was needed. The Duke was urgent with Henry to save the place for him, and set off at once to collect his brilliant chivalry, while Henry, rousing at the trumpet call, declared that nothing ailed him but pageants, sent orders to all his troops to collect from different quarters, and prepared to take the command in person, while reports daily came in of the great muster the Armagnacs were making, as though determined to offer battle. Salisbury was determined not to abide the chances of the battle without first giving a protector to his little daughter, and therefore, as quietly as if she had been merely going to Mass, the Lady Alice was wedded to her Sir Richard Neville, who treated the affair as the simplest matter of course, and troubled himself with very slight demonstrations of affection. The wedding took place at Senlis, whither the female part of the court had accompanied the king, upon the very day of the parting. No one was present, except one of Sir Richard's brothers. The whole family numbered 22, his esquire, and on Alice's side, her father, Esclarmonde, and a few other ladies. At the last moment, however, the king himself came up, leaning on Warwick's arm, looking thin, ill, and flushed, but resolved to do honour to his faithful Salisbury, at whose request he had permitted the barony of Montague to be at once transferred to Neville, who would thenceforth be called by that title. After the ceremony, King Henry kissed the gentle bride, placed a costly ring upon her finger, and gave his best and warmest wishes to the newly married pair. Little guessed any there present what the sound of Warwick and Salisbury would be in 40 years' time to the babe cradled at Windsor. As the king passed Esclarmonde, he paused, and said, in an undertone, "Dear lady, deem not that I have forgotten your holy purpose, but you understand that there are some who are jealous of any benefit conferred on Paris save from themselves, and whose alliance I may not risk. But if God be pleased to grant me this battle also, then, with his good pleasure, I shall not be forced to have such respect to persons, and when I return, lady, whether the endowment come from your bounty or no, God helping us, you shall begin the holy work of St. Catherine's beadswomen among the poor of Paris." But while Henry V, with all his grave sweetness, spoke these words to Esclarmonde de Luxembourg, this was the farewell of Countess Jacqueline of Hainaut to Malcolm Stuart. "Look here, my languishing swain, never mind her scorn, but win your spurs in the battle that is to be, and then make some excuse to get back again to us before the two kings, with all their scruples. Then beshrew me but she shall be yours. If Monseigneur de Thérouenne and I cannot manage one proud girl, I am not Countess of Hainaut." This promise sent him away, planning the enjoyment of conquering Esclarmonde's long resistance, and teaching her where to find happiness. Should he punish her, by being stern and tyrannical at first? Or should his kindness teach her to repent? When he was a knight, he would be in a condition to assert his authority, he thought, and of knighthood both he and Ralph Percy felt almost certain, in that wholesale dubbing of knights that was wont to be the preliminary of a battle. To be sure, they had indulged in a good many unlicensed pleasures at Paris, Ralph from sheer reckless love of sport, Malcolm in his endeavour to forget himself, and to be manly, but they had escaped detection, and they knew plenty of young Englishmen, and many more Burgundians and Gascons, who had plunged far deeper into mischief, and thought it no disgrace, but rather held that there was some special dispensation for the benefit of warriors. Malcolm and Ralph were riding with a party of these young men. King Henry had consented to make his first day's journey as far as Corbeil in a litter, since only there he was to meet the larger number of his troops, whom Bedford and Warwick were assembling. James was riding close beside him, with his immediate attendants, and the two youths, not being needed, had joined their comrades with the advanced guard of the escort. It was always a fiction maintained by Henry, that he was marching in a friendly country, plunder was strictly forbidden, and everything was to be paid for, but unfortunately, the peasantry on his way never realized this, and the soldiery often took care they should not. Therefore, when the advanced guard came to the village that had been marked out for their halt, instead of finding provisions and forage to be purchased, they met with only bare walls, and a few stray cats, and while storming and raving between hunger and disappointment, a report came from somewhere that the inhabitants had fled, and driven off their cattle to another village some 4 miles off, in the woods, on the heights above. Of course, they must be taught reason. It was true that the men-at-arms, who were under the command of Sir Christopher Kitson and Sir William Trenton, were obliged to abide where they were, much as Kitson growled at being unable to procure a draught of wine for Trenton, whom he had been nursing for weeks under intermitting fever, caught at Moe. But the young gentlemen were well pleased to show themselves under no Yorkshireman's orders, and galloped off en masse to procure refreshment for their horses and themselves, further stimulated by the report that the Armagnacs had left a sick man behind them there, who might be a valuable prisoner. By and by, a woodland path brought the disorderly party, about 40 in number, including their servants and the ruffians who always followed whenever plunder was to be scented, out upon a pretty French village of the better class, built round a green shaded with chestnuts, under which, sure enough, were hay-carts, cows, sheep, and goats, and their owners, taking refuge in a place thought to be out of the track of the invaders. Here were the malicious defrauders of the hungry warriors. Down upon them flew the angry foragers. Soon the pretty tranquil scene was ringing with the oaths of the plundering and the cries of the plundered. The cattle were being driven off, the houses and farmyards rifled, blood was flowing, and what could not be carried off was burning. The search for the Armagnac prisoner had, however, relaxed after the first inquiry, and Malcolm, surprised that this had been forgotten, suddenly bethought him of the distinction he should secure by sending a valuable prize to Esclairmon's feet. He seized on an old man who had not been able to fly, and stood trembling and panting in a corner, and demanded where the sick man was. The old man pointed to a farmhouse, round which clouds of smoke were rolling, and Malcolm hurried into it, shouting, "Dog of an Armagnac, come out! Yield, ere thou be burnt!" No answer, and he dashed forward. In the lower room was a sight that opened his eyes with horror, no other than the shield of Drummond, with the 3 wavy lines, aye, and with it the helmet and suit of armor, whereof he knew each buckle and brace. "Paddy! Patrick! Patrick Drummond," he wildly shouted, "are you there?" No answer, and seeing through the smoke a stair, he rushed up. There, in an upper room, on a bed, lay a senseless form, suffocated perhaps by the smoke, but unmistakably his cousin. He called to him, seized him, shook him, dragged him out of bed, all in vain. There was no sign of animation. The fire was gaining on the house, Malcolm's own breath was failing, and his frenzied efforts to carry Patrick's almost giant form to the stairs were quite unavailing. Wild with horror, he flew shouting downstairs to call Halbert, whom he had left with his horse, but neither Halbert nor horse was in sight, nor indeed any of the party. Not a man was in sight, except a few hurrying far out of reach, as if something had alarmed them. He wrung his hands in anguish, and was about to make another attempt to drag Patrick down from the already burning house, when suddenly a troop of horse was among the scene of desolation, and at their head King James himself. Malcolm flew to the king, cutting short his angry exclamation with the cry, "Help! Help! He will burn! Patrick! Paddy Drummond! There!" James had scarce gathered the sense of the words, ere, leaping from his horse, he bounded up the stairs, through the smoke, amid flakes of burning thatch falling from the roof, groped in the dense clouds of smoke for the senseless weight, and holding the shoulders while Malcolm held the feet, they sped down the stair, and rested not till they had laid him under a chestnut tree, out of reach of the crash of the house, which fell in almost instantly. "Does he live?" gasped Malcolm. "He will not," said the king, "if his nation be known here. Keep out of his sight. He must hear only French." Remembering how inexorably Henry hung every Scotch prisoner, Malcolm's heart sank. This was why no one had sought the prisoner. A Scot was not available for ransom. Should he be the murderer of his cousin, Lily's love? Meantime James hurriedly explained to Kitson that here was the sick man left by the enemy, summoned Sir Nigel to his side, closed his own visor, and called for water, then hung over the prisoner, anxious to prevent the first word from being broad Scotch. In the free air, some long sobs showed that Patrick was struggling back to life, and James at once said, "Rendez-vous, messire," but he neither answered, nor was there meaning in his eyes. And James perceived that he was bandaged as though for broken ribs, and that his right shoulder was dislocated, and no doubt had been a second time pulled out when Malcolm had grasped him by the arms. He swooned again at the first attempt to lift him, and a haycart having been left in the flight of the marauders, he was laid in it, and covered with the king's cloak, to be conveyed to Corbeil, where James trusted to secure his life by personal intercession with Henry. He groaned heavily several times, but never opened his eyes or spoke articulately the whole way, and James and Sir Nigel kept on either side of the cart, ready to address him in French the first moment, having told the English that he was a prisoner of quality, who must be carefully conveyed to King James's tent at Corbeil. Malcolm was not allowed to approach, lest he should be recognized, and he rode along in an agony of shame and suspense, with very different feelings towards Patrick than those with which he had of late thought of him, or of his own promises. If Patrick died through this plundering raid, how should he ever face Lily? It was nearly night ere they reached Corbeil, where the tents were pitched outside the little town. James committed his captive to the prudent care of old Baird, bidding him send for a French or Burgundian surgeon, unable to detect the Scottish tongue, and then, taking Malcolm with him, he crossed the square in the centre of the camp to the royal pavilion, opposite to which his own was pitched. It was a sultry night, and Henry had insisted on sleeping in his tent, declaring himself sick of stone walls, and as they approached his voice could be heard in brief excited sentences, giving orders, and asking for the King of Scots. "Here, sir," said James, stopping in where the curtain was looped up, and showed King Henry half sitting, half lying, on a couch of cushions and deerskins, his eyes full of fire, his thin face flushed with deep colour, Bedford, March, Warwick, and Salisbury in attendance. "Ho! You are late," said Henry. "Did you come up with the caitiff robbers?" "They made off as we rode up. The village was already burnt." "Who were they?" "I hope you hung them on the spot, as I bade," continued Henry, coughing between his sentences, and almost in spite of himself, putting his hand to his side. "I was delayed. There was a life to save, a gentleman who lay sick and stifled in a burning house." "And what was it to you," cried Henry, angrily, "if a dozen rebel Armagnacs were fried alive, when I sent you to hinder my men from growing mere thieves? Gentlemen, forsooth! One would think it the Dauphin himself, or mayhap Buchan. Ha! It is a Scot, then." "Yes, sir," said James, Sir Patrick Drummond, "a good knight, hurt and helpless, for whom I entreat your grace." "You disobeyed me to spare a Scot," burst forth Henry. "You, who call yourself a captain of mine, and who know my will. He hangs instantly." "Harry, bethink yourself. This is no captive taken in battle. He is a sick man, left behind, sorely hurt." "Then wherefore must you be meddling, instead of letting him burn as he deserved, and heeding what you undertook for me? I will have none of your traitor ruffians here. Since you have brought him in, the halter for him. Here, Ralph Percy, tell the provost marshal." He was interrupted, for James unbuckled his sword, and tendered it to him. "King Harry," he said gravely, "this morning I was your friend and brother in arms, now I am your captive. Hang Patrick Drummond, who aided me at Meaux in saving my honour and such freedom as I have, and I return to any prison you please, and never strike blow for you again." "Take back your sword," said Henry. "What folly is this? You knew that I count not your rebel subjects as prisoners of war." "I did not know that I was saving a defenseless man from the flames to be used like a dog. I never offered my arm to serve a savage tyrant." "Take your sword," reiterated Henry, his passion giving way before James's steady calmness. "We will look into it tomorrow, but it was no soldierly act to take advantage of my weariness, to let my commands be broken the first day of taking the field, and bring the caitiff here. We will leave him for the night, I say. Take up your sword." "Not till I am sure of my liegeman's life," said James. "No threats, sir." "I will make no promise," said Henry, haughtily, but the words died away in a racking cough. And Bedford, laying his hand on James's arm, said, "He is fevered and weary. Fret him no longer, but take your sword, and get your fellow out of the camp." James was too much hurt to make a compromise. "No," he said, "unless your brother freely spares the life of a man thus taken, I must be his prisoner, but his soldier never." He left the tent, followed by Malcolm in an agony of despair and self-reproach. Henry's morning decisions were not apt to vary from his evening ones. There was a terrible implacability about him at times, and he had never ceased to visit his brother of Clarence's death upon the Scots, on the plea that they were in arms against their king. Even Bedford obviously thought that the prisoner would be safest out of his reach, and this could hardly be accomplished, since Patrick had been placed in James's tent, in the very centre of the camp, near the king's own. And though Bedford and March might have connived at his being taken away, yet the mass of the soldiery would, if they detected a Scot being smuggled away into the town, have been persuaded that King James was acting treacherously. Besides, the captive himself proved to be so exhausted, that to transport him any further in his present state would have been almost certainly fatal. A barber surgeon from Corbeil had been fetched, and was dealing with the injuries, which had apparently been the effect of a fall some days previously, probably when on his way to join the French army at Cosny, and the first fever of these hurts had no doubt been aggravated by the adventures of the day. At any rate, Patrick lay unconscious, or only from time to time groaning or murmuring a few words, sometimes French, sometimes Scotch. Malcolm would have fallen on his knees by his side, and striven to win a word or a look, but James forcibly withheld him. "If you roused him into loud ravings in our own tongue, all hope of saving him would be gone," he said. "Shall we?" "Oh, can we?" cried Malcolm, catching at the mere word hope. "I only know," said the king, "that unless we do so by Harry's goodwill, I will never serve under him again." "And if he persists in his cruelty?" "Then must some means be found of carrying Drummond into Corbeil. It will go hard with me, but he shall be saved, Malcolm. But this whole army is against a Scot, and Harry's eye is everywhere, and his fierceness unrelenting. Malcolm, this is bondage. May God and St. Andrew aid us." When the king came to saying that, it was plain he deemed the case past all other aid. Malcolm's misery was great. The very sight of Patrick had made a mighty revulsion in his feelings. The almost forgotten associations of Glenisky were revived, the forms of his guardian and of Lily came before him, as he heard familiar names and phrases in the dear home accent fall from the fevered lips. Coldingham rose up before him, and Streatabs, with Lily watching on the rocks for tidings of her knight, to whom her brother had once promised to resign all his lands and honors, but who now lay captured by plunderers, among whom that brother made one, and in peril of a shameful death. Oh, far better die in his stead, than return to Lily with tidings such as these. Was this retribution for his broken purpose, and for having fallen away, not merely into secular life, but into sins that stood between him and religious rights? The king had called St. Andrew to aid. Must a proof of repentance and change be given, ere that aid would come? Should he vow himself again to the cloister, yield up the hope of Esclairmont, and devote himself for Patrick's sake? Could he ever be happy with Patrick dead, and Esclairmont driven and harassed into being his wife? Were it not better to vow at once, that so his cousin were spared he would return to his old purposes? Almost had he uttered the vow, when, tugging hard at his heart, came the vision of Esclairmont's loveliness, and he felt it beyond his strength to resign her voluntarily. Besides, how Madame of Hainaut and Monseigneur de Therouenne would deride his uncertainties, and how intolerable it would be to leave Esclairmont to fall into the hands of Beaumont of Burgundy. Such a renunciation could not be made. He did not even know that Patrick's safety depended on it, and instead of that, he promised, with great fervency of devotion, that if St. Andrew would save Patrick Drummond and bring about the 2 marriages, a most splendid monastery for educational purposes, such as the king so much wished to found, should be his reward. It should be in honor of St. Andrew, and should be endowed with Esclairmon's wealth, which would be quite ample enough, both for this and for a noble portion for Lily. Surely St. Andrew must accept such a vow, and spare Patrick. So Malcolm tried to pacify an anguish of suspense that would not be pacified.